So I've avoided listening to any of the singles that have come out recently from Peter Gabriel's forthcoming album I.O. And, that's because I generally will avoid listening to singles if I know I'm going to buy an album, right? Based on the assumption that, the single release is driven more by marketing concerns than artistic concerns. I generally assume that the point of the single is to build interest in the album. If I know I'm going to buy the album, listen to the album, then all I'm really doing if I listen to the single is unbalancing the encounter with the whole work. Now, I'm probably not going to go to any of the shows this tour. I've already seen Peter live, and I just don't really want to pay the money I would need to for decent seats. I can't pay the money I would need to for good seats, and I don't want to pay the money I would need to for shitty seats. So I don't need to know the songs ahead of the tour because I'm not going to the tour. And so, basically I've been treating the singles roughly like you would treat the spoilers for a movie that you're planning to watch. But at some point, it kind of became obvious that Gabriel was doing more than just releasing a couple pre-album singles to build interest in the album, right? I noticed that, for one thing, every song has had what's called a dark side mix, light side mix, and an inside mix. And also, it looks as though every song on the album apparently is going to be released as a single over the course of about a year, right? So that kind of piqued my curiosity, if for no other reason than I really began to wonder if that release strategy was part of a larger statement, if experiencing the album in this kind of piecemeal, multiple version way was actually part of the idea of it, and if maybe I was betraying some kind of artistic concept by just saying, I'll buy it when it comes out. I also realized that in 6 months, there's probably going to be some kind of AI unit that can reach into your dreams and construct an infinite flow of Peter Gabriel music based on an idealized version of Peter Gabriel pulled from your subconscious, at which point there'll be no reason to listen to actual Peter Gabriel singles, particularly not, late career stuff that nobody seems that pumped about. And so I thought I would enjoy listening to new Peter Gabriel while the concept of new Peter Gabriel is still relevant to human experience. So as of this video, 3 tracks have been released: Panopticom, The Court, and Playing for Time. I had thought about the idea of doing a separate video reviewing each of those songs, but I honestly don't know if I have enough to say about each of them that I could really justify that. I also thought about doing a, light side mix and a dark side mix of this video as a gag, but I wasn't really able to think of anything interesting to do with that beyond just sort of have the concept exist, which is maybe a preview of how well it's been pulled off by Gabriel's work. But what I'm going to do instead is briefly talk about each of the songs and respond a little bit to the difference between the mixes, such as they are, and then offer my thoughts about what's happening here with the larger release strategy. Basically, whether it seems at this point to actually be some kind of credible artistic framework or, if it's more of a marketing ploy. So the first song is called Panopticom. It's based around an acoustic guitar line that kind of sounds to me almost like somebody playing an acoustic guitar on VST with a MIDI controller. I don't know if it is that. I mean, it probably isn't. I don't know why you would do that if you're Peter Gabriel, but it's been played and mixed in such a way that it kind of has that effect, if that makes sense. There's also sort of a screamy, ultra-processed vocal sound. It reminds me a bit of the way he distorts his sample vocals on Intruder. He kind of uses that sound in a few other places as well, but Intruder is kind of the definitive use of that sound in my mind. It seems notable maybe that he chose a first single that opens with that sound, because it does kind of assert like, hey, here I am, still me, Beyond those 2 elements, you have mostly just a lot of synthesizer sounds underlying the arrangement. They all kind of sound like, I don't know, like an omnisphere patch or something to me, right? You have some percussion sounds that are either programmed percussion or a live drummer being mixed to sound like programmed percussion. A lot of this stuff rings kind of familiar to me because I do use a lot of these kind of, synthesizer VSTs like Omnisphere, Vacuum Pro, Gravity that, have a lot of patches built in with some interesting sounds. It can be a little tempting sometimes to just pick a cool sounding patch and play 1 or 2 notes, and you get an interesting noise in your track without a lot of effort, right? I've spent more time playing acoustic guitar with a MIDI controller than I really want to admit, which is why that sound kind of reminded me of that when I heard it. Now, I don't know the history of these sounds, right? I'm sure that anything that sounds guitarish either is a guitar or, some kind of fancy Middle Eastern stringed instrument that I've never heard of. It might very well be that, any synthesizer sound here, somebody spent hours slaving over a rack of physical modular synths. I don't doubt any of that, right? But at the end of the day, the result tends to kind of sound like something that was built with about $1,000 worth of VSTs. It's interesting because I think it's become so easy now to build something that sounds like this out of plugins and patches and MIDI that the paradigm's it's come all the way around from where it was when Gabriel started, where, in the late 70s, the early 80s, to do something with acoustic instruments, to do something on acoustic guitar or acoustic piano, it sounded, that was the thing that sounded sort of predictable and easy and cheap, right? And a carefully programmed, highly tuned synth sound that sounded cutting edge and of the moment and distinctive and expensive, right? And we've kind of had this switch, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, where playing something with, acoustic instruments, organic instruments, that doesn't sound produced in a way where all the kind of fine edges are taken off the performance. That's kind of become the luxury move, right? And all these finely crafted electronic sounds have begun to paradoxically sound cheap. Lyrically, I guess it's fine. I get what he's trying to do, right? He's talking about the constant surveillance state that results from everybody having a phone with them all the time. And, I appreciate the attempt to describe the moment, but lyrically it almost ends up, it's kind of like an essay, right? And, an essay, you really have to say something. And I don't know that this does much more than kind of gesture at a general condition. It's not really emotionally moving, but it's not intellectually provocative, really. It's a very big swing, and I admire that, but it feels like a big swing where he's ended up hitting a single. And the various mixes really don't sound different from each other in any meaningful way. You can hear, if you compare them side by side, you can certainly hear different elements added or emphasized, right? But to me, all the things that are going in and out in the different mixes ultimately just sound like minor variations on the same kind of burbly synth patches and electronic percussion. I listened to all three mixes of this song maybe an hour ago. And if you put any of the three on right now, I couldn't begin to tell you which one I was hearing. Now, the chord progression, the vocal melody, those things aren't lazy, right? They feel like the product of time and work. They don't feel tossed off. They don't feel half-assed. But they're somehow still not really that memorable or moving, at least not, the 3 times in a row that I listened to the song this morning. The whole song has that quality in terms of the writing and the lyrics and the production, where it all feels not the least bit lazy, in fact, very labored over, very crafted, and somehow still at the same time like a lot of work has been done to end up somewhere underwhelming. The vocal effect on the chorus does have a pretty interesting texture. That's a cool production choice. Sounds like those are live strings, and they are playing a few notes that are kind of dissonant and surprising, edging towards something that really kind of might take things out of predictability, but only in a momentary way. And the lyrics here are quite underwhelming. I wasn't that kind to the lyrics to Panopticom, but at least that felt like it was making a distinct statement that was kind of unique to the moment, right? Obviously the flaws of the justice system are an important topic. I don't deny that. But, there's only the vaguest of critiques being made here. Lines like, we've lost the line between the good and the bad. We've lost the line between the sane and the mad. That might have been very poignantly felt when it was written, and maybe you agree with that even, right? I know lots of people who would agree with that, but lots of people would have agreed with that in 1974. It's a generic kind of statement masquerading as a meaningful one. The whole song kind of has this quality of being something that is theoretically a political critique, and yet at the same time something that would be inoffensive or agreeable to like 90% of every political persuasion, which seems to me like it perhaps defeats some of the point of making a political statement. Now, there's one line actually here that I find intriguing, right? He says, all your memory is on your mobile phone. And I'm assuming, if I'm understanding that lyric correctly, the 3 times in a row that I listened to it in slightly different versions, and if I'm understanding his point correctly there, that resonates in a really interesting way with conversations that I've had with people about how, you increasingly don't feel the need to actually learn or retain information. There's no urgency, there's no social capital attached to knowing things because of the constant ready accessibility through phones of trivia. That's a really interesting idea to hint at in a song, a whole song full of observations like that. I mean, I think that's kind of what he was doing with Panopticom, but that one line feels more interesting, more incisive, more meaningful than both the whole of the court and the whole of Panopticom. Now, once again, I'm evaluating these lyrics in terms of argument because it seems like that is what they are attempting to do. Obviously, there are lots of things that a lyric can do other than deliver argument, but that really seems to be the intention here, more so than any of the other possible purposes of the words one would put in a song. These are very point-based lyrics, which are still somehow not making interesting points. In terms of the 3 mixes, once again, the differences are minor and they do almost nothing to affect the mood or texture of the song. The idea of the multiple versions, when I heard of that, I thought, that's going to be interesting if they allow it to create a risk. Theoretically, maybe a really great version or a version that really puts an intriguing spin on the song or a version that adds some totally distinct element, they might create something like that. He might create something like that and have it end up maybe kind of buried as, not literally a B-side, but something that ends up only being on the deluxe version of the album, only known to completist weirdos, right? That's the risk of this idea, and that's the promise of this idea in a way, right? And there has been, so far, none of that. There's been no possibility of that, right? The mixes are so conservative, the changes made to the song are so conservative that there's no room for that kind of accidental secret brilliance. Now, the 3rd track, Playing for Time, is actually quite good. I really like this one. I've been pretty negative on the first 2, but this one, it made a very good first impression. As of now, actually, only a first impression because there is only the one mix that I was able to find. I don't know if that's a change in the strategy or if the other mixes will be coming in the near future. Now, I'm going to need to live with it a while. I'm going to need to go through it a few more times to tell if it's quite good or really excellent. I'm not necessarily in a hurry to listen to it again real soon because I assume there'll be more versions coming of it. So, I don't want to rush myself into overexposure to it. But Gabriel's really well established as being great at sentimental piano ballads, and this is a great sentimental piano ballad. Now, I don't have the expertise to readily break down in terms of what's happening with intervals, but some of the chords and the notes just feel like unexpected, unpredictable choices. The lyric has a lot of evocative phrases. One that I wrote down as I was listening was, "There goes the sun, back to where it came. The young move to the center, mom and dad, the frame." That's great. It's economical, it's interesting, it's surprising, it's emotional, it's got a creative metaphor that's expressed in a very concise way. That's really good writing. Now, I don't know if I want it to do that climax in the last third with the rippling strings. There's something about that part that feels canned in a way the first 2/3 of the song doesn't so much, right? It feels like the sun rising over the Serengeti in a BBC documentary. Maybe as I get to know the song, this ending will register more. I'm definitely willing to leave that possibility open. I don't really feel like the court is going to grow on me much, but I can imagine the last third of this being a grower. So what do I think about all this now, having actually exposed myself to the early singles? Well, that's a very unfortunate choice of words. So what do I think about all this now, having listened to these early singles and their various permutations? I've spent the last couple years trying to learn about contemporary music marketing strategies, right? Or, trying to learn everything about it that can be digested from free YouTube videos. The results of that study have not been earth-shaking, right? But I'm aware of certain basic principles. Look up Electric Brain, Electric Shadow on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. I have to say that at some point. And one of the principles that I'm aware of, is that if you are a new artist without a really established fan base, you're supposed to do what's called the waterfall method, where basically every song on either an EP or an album is released as a single, right? Over time, those singles accrue into a completed piece of work. So you release a single every 4 to 6 weeks, and for the period following the release, you blitz people with different versions of the song, and you give them an instrumental mix and a duet version, and you do an a cappella version on TikTok, and whatever. And if you're really on top of things, then at the end of the 18 months that it takes you to do this, you have your next album already, and you can begin waterfalling singles from that, right? So there's really never a time that you're not putting content out there at a very regular interval. And the point of this, the reason for this strategy is, like I've talked about in other contexts, everything is crying for attention in a giant sea of noise. And as much as anything, all you're trying to do is maximize opportunities for people to be reminded that you exist. Now, to a dedicated fan, to someone who takes it for granted that they're going to buy the album, it might be disappointing to get the album piecemeal. It might be annoying to have all the songs without a clear sense of their intended flow or sequence. It might seem kind of tiresome to get 3 different versions of every song. But we don't matter from a marketing standpoint, right? What matters is the other 99.9% of the people who will check this music out to one extent or another, in one form or another. And the assumption is that all those people are perpetually distracted, that they have no attention span, and that you have to make a whole bunch of noise and wave your arms all the time, or people will just forget that you exist. And the material barriers to releasing music are so low that there's really no reason not to flood the zone with shit. So even for somebody of Gabriel's scale and reputation, it's probably actually wiser to make the most noise that you can for the longest period of time that you can in the most persistent way that you can, right? If you just put the album out, there's going to be maybe a week where everybody's aware of it, and then it's just erased from the public consciousness. The giveaway, I think, that this is in fact some version of that strategy, some version of this kind of music marketing 101, rather than some attempt to really make a statement with a unique release strategy. The giveaway just seems to me to be how grudging and underwhelming these remixes are. They don't feel like they're willing to take any risks. They don't feel like they're willing to even slightly unsettle the definitive sense of what the song is supposed to be, right? They feel kind of like they exist because somebody said they have to exist. Now, I don't have any idea what the final or definitive version of any of these 3 songs is, and it might be that the album version is different from all 3 of these, but I don't really have the sense that there will be any surprise involved or really anything revelatory involved, either in, figuring out which of these is the album version or discovering that there's a 4th, basically still pretty similar mix for the album. Now, you totally could do this as a statement about modern attention spans, right? You could do this kind of strategy in a way that is over-the-top obnoxious, or in a way that satirizes the need to pour out a flood of content, or in a way where you're doing really creative and interesting stuff to actually make a big kind of sea of sound after, especially if you're somebody like Gabriel who's been quiet mostly for the last 20 years. That would be particularly appropriate for this album, given that at least one of the songs is about the nature of life in a world full of electronic media and surveillance. But this doesn't really seem to be that statement, right? It doesn't seem to be trying to make any kind of meta point of that level of complexity or intelligence or provocation. It is a verdict on the nature of the music marketplace today, but it's ultimately kind of an unintentional verdict. And the 3 mix strategy ends up generating a feeling which is similar to how I feel about 2 of these 3 songs, which is, a fair amount of visible effort has been put into generating a product which is ultimately no better than something that might have been made with much less trouble. Now, I'm glad that I waited until Playing for Time was available before I listened to these, because it's given me much more optimism to have that song in the repertoire. But, I ultimately think that this is much more a ploy than an artistic strategy. And, I'll keep up with the songs as they come out, but I'm iffy on the overall promise of the album.